You can still walk through these places. Cities with streets, but no kings. Fortresses without clear enemies. Temples aligned to the sky, yet silent about who commanded them. Built with precision, abandoned without explanation, and preserved just enough to raise more questions than answers. Why invest so much knowledge, labour and planning, only to walk away? Were these cities meant to be lived in, hidden in, worshipped in, or something we no longer recognise? And if mainstream archaeology can describe how they were built, why does it still struggle to explain why they existed at all? Mohenjo Daro. Rising from the flat alluvial plains of Sindh, where the Indus River once braided itself into shifting channels long before modern embankments fixed its course, Mohenjo Daro appears less like a ruin abandoned than a city paused, its baked brick walls eroded to rounded edges, yet still holding the geometry of intention, order and repetition. And as one walks its silent streets today, the scale emerges gradually rather than dramatically, with low platforms, narrow lanes and stepped wells, revealing a city that did not rely on towering monuments to assert its presence, but instead embedded its sophistication into the fabric of daily life. A fabric woven more than 4,000 years ago during the height of the Indus Valley tradition, when this settlement may have housed tens of thousands of people, all operating within a remarkably consistent architectural system that repeats across neighbourhoods with subtle variations, suggesting not only planning but shared rules that governed how space, water and movement were understood. The bricks themselves, uniform in proportion and fired rather than sun-dried, form walls aligned along a grid that runs roughly north-south and east-west. And this regularity persists from domestic quarters to larger public structures, creating the impression that Mohenjo Daro was conceived not as an organic sprawl, but as a coherent urban experiment executed over generations, a quality that becomes especially evident when standing atop the elevated citadel mound where the so-called Great Bath lies, a sunken rectangular basin sealed with bitumen, surrounded by colonnades and fed by carefully controlled channels, its precise function still uncertain, yet clearly central enough to warrant extraordinary construction effort, hinting at ritual, communal gathering, or symbolic purification without leaving inscriptions to confirm any single interpretation. Moving outward from this core, the residential blocks reveal houses built inward around courtyards, often with private wells and latrines, connected to covered drains that run beneath the streets. An infrastructure so methodical that it continues to draw comparison with much later urban systems. And as one follows these drains, some still capped with stone slabs, there is a sense that sanitation and water management were not afterthoughts, but foundational principles, integrated from the outset and maintained with consistency, suggesting administrative oversight without leaving behind palaces, royal tombs, or explicit markers of hierarchy. This absence becomes more conspicuous the longer one walks. For unlike contemporary civilizations in Mesopotamia or Egypt, Mohenjo Daro offers no obvious kings carved in relief. No monumental inscriptions boasting conquest or divine favour, and no grand temples rising above the skyline. Only standardised houses, workshops, granaries whose identification remains debated, and a cityscape that seems to distribute space with a relative evenness that resists easy social stratification, raising questions about how authority functioned here, and whether power was expressed through consensus, custom, or institutions now archaeologically invisible. Artifacts recovered from the site deepen this ambiguity rather than resolving it, as finely carved steatite seals depict animals, composite creatures, and a still undeciphered script arranged in short sequences, repeated across thousands of examples, yet never expanding into longer texts, leaving the language and administrative records of the city tantalizingly out of reach, while figurines, beads of carnelian and lapis lazuli, standardized weights, an evidence of long-distance trade point to an economy integrated across regions stretching from the Arabian Sea to the highlands of Afghanistan, so all coordinated without surviving written contracts or proclamations. Geological and environmental evidence adds another layer of complexity, for the Indus River system has never been static, and sediment cores, flood deposits, and the very erosion visible on Mohenjo Daro's remaining walls suggest that the city endured repeated inundations, rebuilding atop itself in layers that raise the ground level incrementally, a cycle of resilience that eventually may have strained even its well-organized systems, especially as climatic shifts altered monsoon patterns and river courses migrated, potentially undermining agriculture and trade networks that sustained urban life. Yet the end of Mohenjo Daro does not present itself as a single catastrophe frozen in time, for there is little sign of widespread violence, no clear burn layer marking destruction, and no mass graves that would point to sudden collapse, instead offering a quieter disappearance in which maintenance waned, standards loosened, quality declined and population thinned, as if the city slowly lost the cohesion that once bound it together. Walking through the lower town today, where street corners curve gently, and doorways open onto rooms whose functions can only be inferred from their proportions, one becomes aware of how much remains unknown despite a century of excavation, including why certain areas were elevated, how decisions were made across such a large population, and what beliefs animated daily routines in the absence of iconography that names gods or rulers, leaving scholars to weigh competing hypotheses that range from decentralized governance to ritual systems centered on water, fertility, or cyclical renewal. Even the city's name is a modern imposition, translating loosely to Mound of the Dead, bestowed long after its original inhabitants had vanished, their own designation for this place lost alongside their script, and this linguistic gap mirrors the broader silence that surrounds Mohenjo Daro, where material clarity coexists with interpretive restraint, forcing each observation to stop short of certainty. Preservation challenges now mirror ancient vulnerabilities, as rising groundwater, salinity and exposure threaten the remaining structures, reminding visitors that the city's survival into the present is provisional, dependent on careful balance much like it was millennia ago. And as one exits the site, retracing paths laid out with measured precision in another age, the enduring impression is not of mystery as spectacle, but of restraint, of a civilization that expressed its complexity through order rather than monumentality, and whose unanswered questions persist not because evidence is lacking, but because the evidence points consistently to a way of organizing human life that does not align neatly with later historical models, leaving Mohenjo Daro suspended between familiarity and distance, a place that can still be walked through today, yet continues to withhold its final explanations, inviting observation without resolution. Mesa Verde cliff dwellings. Set high within the folded sandstone canyons of southwestern Colorado, where pinon and juniper cling to thin soils and winter light reaches the cliffs at sharp, oblique angles. Mesa Verde cliff dwellings reveal themselves gradually rather than all at once, first as dark recesses in pale rock, then as geometric patterns, resolving into walls, doorways, and kivas suspended between earth and sky, and walking the narrow trails that wind along the canyon rims. Before descending into these alcoves, one becomes aware that the setting is inseparable from the architecture, that the dwellings are not merely built into the cliffs, but shaped by them, responding precisely to overhangs that shield from snow and summer sun while offering vantage points across a landscape of mesas, ravines, and seasonal water sources. Constructed primarily during the late 12th and 13th centuries by ancestral Puebloan communities, these structures represent the culmination of centuries of architectural adaptation in the Four Corners region. Yet they also mark a distinct shift, as earlier generations had lived atop the mesas in pit houses and surface pueblos before moving downward into the canyon walls, a transition that suggests changing social, environmental, or defensive considerations without leaving a written explanation to clarify the decision. The masonry itself carries evidence of accumulated knowledge, with shaped sandstone blocks, carefully fitted using mud mortar. Walls rising multiple stories high within the protective curve of the alcoves, and wooden beams, some still visible, harvested from distant uplands and hauled across uneven terrain, later dated through tree ring analysis to remarkably precise years, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct building episodes that occurred within short bursts rather than over long incremental spans, implying coordinated labour and shared planning across extended families or clans. As one steps into Cliff Palace, the largest of the dwellings, the density becomes apparent, with more than 100 rooms packed into a space that seems improbably compact, punctuated by circular kivas sunk into the floor, their fire pits, ventilation shafts, and sipapus reflecting ritual continuity with much older Puebloan traditions, while ladders once connected levels vertically, creating a layered circulation pattern that favoured inward-facing movement over outward display. Daily life here would have unfolded within a careful balance of agriculture and foraging, with corn, beans, and squash cultivated on mesa tops above, dependent on rainfall patterns that could fluctuate dramatically from year to year, and supplemented by hunting and gathering in surrounding areas, a subsistence strategy that functioned effectively for generations but remained vulnerable to prolonged droughts, evidence of which appears in both tree ring data and soil studies from the late 1200s, coinciding closely with the period when these cliff dwellings were most intensively occupied. Yet environmental stress alone does not fully account for the complexity of the site, for the effort invested in building at such inaccessible locations suggests motivations beyond simple shelter, as the alcoves offer defensibility and concealment, narrowing access points and controlling movement in ways that earlier mesatop villages did not, hinting at increased social tension or regional instability that may have prompted communities to seek refuge in more protected settings, even as trade networks continued to link Mesa Verde to distant regions through the exchange of pottery styles, turquoise, macaw feathers, and other materials that speak to cultural connections extending far beyond the visible horizon. Pottery fragments scattered across floors and middens preserve these links in their painted designs and forms, while stone tools, weaving implements, and storage jars indicate households organized around shared labor and seasonal rhythms, all functioning within spaces that blur the boundary between domestic and ceremonial life, since kivas appear interwoven with living quarters rather than segregated, reinforcing the sense that ritual was embedded in routine rather than isolated from it. Despite this coherence, the occupation of the cliff dwellings was relatively brief, spanning only a few decades before the sites were systematically abandoned. And what stands out in the archaeological record is not evidence of destruction or chaos, but of orderly departure as usable tools were taken, rooms swept, and structures left largely intact, creating a stillness that lingers today and invites speculation without offering definitive answers. Theories range from climatic deterioration and crop failure to social realignment, migration, or the pull of more reliable water. Sources farther south, where descendant Pueblo communities later emerged, carrying with them oral histories that speak of movement and transformation rather than collapse, framing Mesa Verde not as an endpoint, but as one chapter within a longer cultural continuum. Walking through Balcony House or Spruce Tree House, navigating ladders and low doorways shaped for bodies accustomed to crouching and climbing, the physicality of the space becomes impossible to ignore, reminding visitors that these were not abstract designs, but lived environments that demanded constant interaction with stone, wood, and elevation, and that the choice to leave them behind would not have been made lightly. The silence that now fills the alcoves amplifies this awareness as wind moves through empty rooms and light traces the same paths it did centuries ago, illuminating plastered walls still bearing fingerprints and smoke stains, subtle records of individual presence that resist anonymity. Preservation efforts have stabilized what remains, yet erosion continues its slow work, just as it did before the dwellings were built, reinforcing the sense that these structures exist within a longer geological timescale that both frames and diminishes human occupation. And so Mesa Verde persists as a place that can still be walked through today, not as a monument frozen at the moment of abandonment, but as a landscape where architecture, environment and history remain in dialogue, offering clarity in craftsmanship and planning, while withholding certainty about the decisions that shaped its final chapter, leaving the visitor with an understanding grounded in evidence yet open to reflection, aware that the most enduring aspect of the cliff dwellings may be not the answers they provide, but the disciplined restraint with which they continue to pose their questions. Derinkuyu Underground City. Beneath the soft volcanic plains of central Anatolia, where the surface landscape of Cappadocia appears open, sunlit and deceptively calm, the entrance to Derinkuyu Underground City offers little warning of what lies below, a modest opening descending into darkness that gradually reveals a vertical world carved not in haste but through accumulated intention, as corridors slope downward and branch outward into a subterranean settlement that extends more than 60 meters beneath the modern ground level, unfolding layer by layer into a complex environment of chambers, passageways, and engineered systems whose scale only becomes comprehensible through movement, through the steady descent that replaces daylight with filtered air and muted sound. Carved entirely from soft, tough bedrock, formed by ancient volcanic eruptions, Derinkuyu was not hollowed out as a single project, but expanded incrementally over centuries, possibly millennia, beginning with simple storage rooms and refugees, before evolving into a fully integrated underground city, capable, at least in theory, of sheltering thousands of people along with their animals, food stores, and essential infrastructure, all hidden beneath an unassuming surface. As one passes through narrow tunnels designed to force single-file movement, the design logic becomes apparent, favouring control, containment and defensibility, with massive circular stone doors, each weighing several hundred kilograms, set into side recesses so they could be rolled across corridors from within, sealing off entire sections in moments and transforming the underground network into a series of compartmentalized zones, a feature that suggests repeated anticipation of threat without preserving a clear record of its source. Ventilation shafts cut vertically through the rock provide fresh air to even the deepest levels, some doubling as wells, others branching subtly to distribute airflow, demonstrating an understanding of subterranean engineering that extends beyond improvisation and into sustained habitability, while niches carved into walls held oil lamps whose soot marks remain visible, testifying to long-term use rather than brief refuge. Deeper inside, the spatial diversity increases, revealing stables near upper levels where animals could be kept without contaminating living areas, followed by kitchens with blackened ceilings, wine and oil presses carved directly into the stone, storage rooms with raised platforms to protect grain from moisture, and communal spaces whose proportions hint at gathering, instruction or ritual, including a cruciform hall often identified as a church from the Byzantine period, though the underground complex itself almost certainly predates that era in its earliest phases. Scholars generally agree that Derinkuyu reached its most extensive form during late antiquity, when early Christian communities in the region sought refuge from periodic persecution or military incursions, yet the city's origins may reach back much further, potentially to the Phrygian period of the first millennium BCE, when similar rock-cut spaces were already common across Cappadocia, suggesting a continuity of subterranean practice rather than a single historical response. Written sources remain sparse and indirect, offering little more than passing references to underground refugees, leaving archaeology to reconstruct function through physical evidence alone. And while the sophistication of the design implies careful planning, it also reveals constraints, as low ceilings, steep stairways, and limited sanitation would have imposed physical strain during extended occupation, indicating that Derinkuyu was likely intended for episodic use rather than permanent residence. A place of withdrawal during moments of danger rather than a hidden civilization operating in parallel with the surface world. Environmental conditions reinforce this interpretation, as temperature and humidity remain relatively stable underground, ideal for preserving food, but challenging for long-term comfort. And the reliance on vertical shafts for air and water would have required constant maintenance and vigilance, especially during periods when the city was sealed. Yet the absence of skeletal remains, mass burials, or signs of violent destruction suggests that Derinkuyu fulfilled its purpose effectively, allowing its occupants to emerge and resume surface life without catastrophic loss. A success that paradoxically contributes to the site's ambiguity by denying historians the dramatic evidence often used to anchor narratives of conflict or collapse. As one navigates the labyrinth today, the sense of scale shifts repeatedly, from claustrophobic tunnels barely wide enough for shoulders to broader halls where the ceiling rises. Unexpectedly, creating moments of spatial release that hint at psychological considerations woven into the design, as if the builders understood not only the physical but the mental demands of living underground, even temporarily. The city's integration with neighbouring underground networks, some of which may connect to Derinkuyu through long, partially unexplored tunnels, expands the mystery further, suggesting regional coordination or shared cultural knowledge that extended beyond a single community, embedding Derinkuyu within a wider subterranean landscape whose full extent remains uncertain. Modern excavation and stabilization have rendered parts of the city accessible, yet much remains closed, either for safety or preservation, reinforcing the impression that what is visible represents only a fraction of what exists, and that the city's logic cannot be grasped from any single vantage point, but only through cumulative movement and repetition. Standing deep within the lower levels, where sound diminishes and orientation becomes abstract, the surface world feels distant, not just physically but conceptually, emphasizing how deliberately Derinkuyu was designed to invert normal relationships between above and below, visibility and concealment, openness and control. And when one finally ascends back toward daylight, retracing the same inclined passages carved centuries ago, the experience leaves behind not a single conclusion, but a layered impression of adaptation, caution, and resilience. A recognition that this underground city was neither a mythic refuge nor an anomaly, but a pragmatic response, refined over generations, whose full story remains partially sealed within the rock itself, accessible to the body, but resistant to final explanation, enduring as a place that can still be walked through today, while continuing to withhold the circumstances that once made such depth not extraordinary but necessary. Chichen Itza. Rising from the limestone plain of northern Yucatan, where dense scrub forest conceals a landscape shaped as much by water beneath the ground as by stone above it, Chichen Itza presents itself not as a ruin overtaken by nature, but as a carefully ordered expanse where architecture, terrain, and horizon remain in deliberate conversation. And walking its wide causeways today, the scale emerges through alignment rather than height, as plazas open gradually and structures reveal their significance through proportion, placement, and repetition, rather than immediate visual dominance. Founded during the late Classic period and reaching its greatest influence between the 9th and 12th centuries, Chichen Itza occupied a strategic position near cenotes, natural sinkholes formed by collapsed limestone, that provided reliable access to water in a region without surface rivers, anchoring the city, both practically and symbolically, within a landscape defined by permeability and depth. The most recognizable structure, El Castillo, rises in stepped symmetry at the center of the site, its 4 stairways climbing toward a temple platform and its geometry calibrated to the solar year. Yet the experience of standing before it resists reduction to calendrical explanation alone, as the pyramid's mass, orientation and acoustics create a sense of order that feels both mathematical and ceremonial, reinforced by the play of light and shadow during equinoxes that produces the well-known serpent illusion along its balustrade, an effect that likely functioned less as spectacle than as confirmation of cosmological alignment within a broader ritual system. Surrounding this core, the Great Ball Court stretches to an imposing length, its parallel walls rising high above a narrow playing surface, with carved reliefs depicting the ritualized stakes of the game. Yet even here, interpretation remains measured, as the imagery speaks clearly of ceremony and symbolism, without conclusively defining how frequently or under what conditions such events occurred, reminding observers that monumental scale does not necessarily equate to constant use. Further outward, the Temple of the Warriors and its forest of columns suggests gatherings, processions, or markets, while the adjacent group of 1,000 columns implies roofing systems now lost, pointing to spaces that once mediated between interior and exterior life. And as one moves through these areas, the architecture reveals a synthesis of styles, blending elements associated with Puk traditions of the northern Maya lowlands, with influences often linked to central Mexico, a convergence that has long prompted discussion about migration, exchange, or shared ideological frameworks, rather than abrupt conquest. Inscriptions and carved motifs reinforce this hybridity without resolving it, presenting dates, figures, and symbols that anchor the site within the Maya world, while simultaneously distinguishing it from earlier southern lowland centers, whose stelae focused more narrowly on dynastic histories. One of the most intriguing structures, El Caracol, rises with rounded walls and internal staircases that defy the rectilinear norms elsewhere in the city. Its windows are lined with celestial events, suggesting sustained astronomical observation integrated into civic planning. Yet here again the evidence supports careful attention rather than singular obsession, implying that astronomy functioned as one component within a larger system of governance, ritual timing and spatial order. The sacred cenote, located at the northern edge of the site and connected by a long sakbi or causeway, introduces a quieter but more profound dimension, as dredging conducted in the early 20th century recovered offerings of jade, gold, ceramics, and human remains, indicating repeated ceremonial deposition over centuries, an activity that binds Chichen Itza's monumental core to the unseen depths below, reinforcing the idea that water, access, and obligation were inseparable from political authority. Despite this wealth of material evidence, the city's social organisation remains partially obscured, as royal tombs, comparable to those found at sites like Tikal or Palenque, are absent. And while iconography depicts elite figures, it does so within broader scenes that emphasise collective ritual over individual lineage, suggesting a political structure that may have been more distributed or council-based than strictly dynastic, though certainty remains elusive. Environmental data adds further nuance, as sediment cores and climate proxies indicate periods of drought that would have placed pressure on agricultural systems. Yet Chichen Itza appears to have endured longer than many contemporaneous centres, perhaps due to its access to cenotes and its integration into expansive trade networks linking the Gulf Coast, the Caribbean, and inland regions. Networks evidenced by obsidian, cacao residues, and marine materials found across the site. Eventually, however, activity declined, monumental construction ceased, and the city's prominence faded, not through visible destruction, but through a gradual shift of population and influence, leaving behind structures that continued to draw visitors and pilgrims, even after political power moved elsewhere, complicating any narrative of sudden abandonment. Walking through Chichen Itza today, one senses this continuity in layers. As the city feels neither fully alive nor entirely silent, its spaces too deliberately arranged to read as accidental, yet too restrained in their inscriptions to narrate themselves outright. Preservation efforts have stabilized its forms, but the underlying limestone continues its slow dissolution, mirroring the ancient reliance on water that both sustained and undermined the city. And as the sun moves across the sky, casting shadows that repeat patterns observed centuries ago, the enduring impression is one of balance maintained rather than mystery resolved, a recognition that Chichen Itza's power lay not in hidden knowledge or dramatic collapse, but in its ability to integrate cosmology, environment, and social order into a landscape that remains legible enough to walk through today, yet reserved enough to resist final interpretation, holding its meaning in alignment rather than explanation. Tiwanaku, on the high Andean plateau, near the southern edge of Lake Titicaca, where thin air sharpens light and the horizon stretches unbroken beneath a vast, shifting sky. Tiwanaku emerges from the plain with a quiet insistence, its low stone platforms and scattered monoliths appearing almost provisional against the immensity of the Altiplano, yet revealing through closer movement a level of precision and coherence that suggests long-term planning under environmental conditions that would have challenged even well-adapted communities. Walking the site today, one senses immediately that Tiwanaku was shaped not to dominate its surroundings, but to converse with them. Aligned to cardinal directions, distant mountains, and seasonal cycles, its architecture responding to altitude, frost, and scarcity, with strategies that embedded resilience into both ritual and subsistence. At its height, between roughly the 5th and 10th centuries CE, Tiwanaku functioned as the ceremonial and political center of a state whose influence extended across much of the central Andes, yet the city itself remains enigmatic in scale and density, with open plazas, sunken courts, and platforms arranged in a manner that emphasizes procession and gathering rather than enclosure, suggesting that visibility and participation were as central to its design as authority. The Akapana pyramid rises as the site's dominant mass, a stepped earthen and stone platform once faced with finely cut blocks. Its summit structured to collect and channel water through carved drains that carried rainfall and ritual libations alike, transforming precipitation into a controlled element that reinforced symbolic associations between mountains, fertility, and cosmic order, while also revealing a practical understanding of hydrology at high altitude. Nearby, the semi-subterranean temple presents a contrasting spatial experience. Its sunken floor, enclosed by walls studded with stone heads, each carved with subtle variation, often interpreted as ancestral or regional representations, though their precise meaning remains debated, reflecting an emphasis on collective identity rather than individualized portraiture. The most widely recognized monument, the Gateway of the Sun, stands isolated yet commanding. A single block of andesite, carved with a central figure flanked by attendants arranged in rhythmic symmetry. Its iconography linked to calendrical, cosmological, or ideological frameworks without yielding a definitive reading, as the absence of extensive inscriptions limits interpretation to pattern, repetition, and context rather than explicit narrative. Beyond these core areas lies Pumapunku, where massive stone blocks lie scattered as if disassembled, their finely worked surfaces, drilled holes, and interlocking shapes demonstrating a level of standardization that implies shared templates and skilled labor, even as their current disarray complicates reconstruction and invites speculation tempered by material constraints. Geological sourcing confirms that many stones were transported from quarries tens of kilometers away across uneven terrain, requiring coordinated effort and social organization capable of mobilizing labor at scale without leaving behind written records to describe its mechanisms. Tiwanaku's success cannot be understood without reference to its agricultural foundations, particularly the raised field system known as waru, which transformed frost-prone wetlands into productive farmland by elevating planting surfaces and using surrounding canals to moderate temperature and retain moisture, an innovation that supported large populations while reducing risk in an unpredictable climate, binding ritual authority to food security in ways that reinforce the site's regional influence. Ceramics, textiles and portable art recovered from across the Andes attest to Tiwanaku's reach, carrying its distinctive iconography far beyond the city itself. Yet this expansion appears to have been maintained through shared ideology and economic integration rather than overt militarization, as fortifications and weapons remain limited in the archaeological record, suggesting a model of influence that relied on participation rather than coercion. Despite this apparent stability, Tiwanaku eventually declined, its monumental construction ceasing and its population dispersing, a process that unfolded gradually rather than catastrophically, likely shaped by a combination of prolonged drought, shifting trade networks, and internal reorganization, as paleoclimate data indicates reduced rainfall during the later first millennium CE that would have strained even the adaptive waru system. The absence of widespread destruction layers or mass violence reinforces the impression of transformation rather than collapse, as communities may have withdrawn to more localized centers while retaining elements of Tiwanaku identity that later resurfaced in Andean traditions, including those encountered by the Inca centuries afterward. Walking among the ruins today, the openness of the site invites movement rather than confinement, allowing the visitor to trace alignments, sightlines, and spatial rhythms that remain legible despite loss and erosion, while the precision of stonework contrasts with the fragility of earthen elements, now softened by time, emphasizing how much of the city's original presence depended on maintenance and collective memory. Modern excavation has clarified aspects of chronology and construction, yet large questions persist, particularly regarding governance, ritual practice, and the lived experience of ordinary inhabitants, whose dwellings lie largely beyond the monumental core, reminding observers that Tiwanaku's silence is not the result of neglect, but of a cultural system that communicated through form, repetition, and landscape rather than text. As wind moves across the plateau and clouds gather unpredictably over the lake, the site resists being read as a relic frozen in isolation, instead appearing as a node within a broader environmental and social network that once functioned through balance rather than domination. And the lasting impression is not of an unsolved puzzle demanding resolution, but of a carefully calibrated society whose material traces remain sufficient to walk through, measure and admire, yet deliberately insufficient to translate fully, leaving Tiwanaku poised between understanding and restraint, its meaning carried as much by absence as by stone. Prambanan Temple. Rising from the fertile plain of central Java, where volcanic soils nurture rice fields and distant peaks quietly frame the horizon, Prambanan Temple asserts itself not through gradual discovery, but through sudden vertical clarity, its slender stone towers lifting sharply above the surrounding landscape, visible long before their carved surfaces resolve into detail. And yet, as one approaches on foot, the initial impression of monumentality gives way to a more intricate experience shaped by rhythm, repetition, and spatial sequence rather than sheer scale. Constructed in the 9th century during a period of intense political and religious competition between Hindu and Buddhist courts in Java, Prambanan represents a deliberate architectural statement, one that translates cosmology into stone with remarkable discipline, arranging more than 200 structures according to a concentric plan that draws movement inward toward a sacred core, where the tallest temples rise in hierarchical alignment, their spires echoing the mythic form of Mount Meru, axis of the universe in Hindu thought. The central compound is dominated by 3 principal shrines dedicated to Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma, with the Shiva temple ascending highest, its interior chamber housing a large statue of Shiva Mahadeva, while subsidiary temples honor their associated mounts, creating a carefully balanced ensemble that encodes theological relationships into spatial order. Walking the raised stone walkways that connect these shrines, one becomes aware that Prambanan is designed not for a single viewpoint, but for circumambulation, encouraging movement that unfolds meaning gradually, reinforced by narrative reliefs carved along the balustrades that depict episodes from the Ramayana, their scenes progressing sequentially as the visitor moves clockwise, transforming architecture into a vessel for story, memory, and instruction. These reliefs, finely detailed yet restrained, emphasize gesture, posture, and rhythm over dramatic expression, suggesting an aesthetic that values continuity and moral order rather than spectacle, while also revealing close ties to Indian narrative traditions adapted through local artistic conventions. Beyond the central temples, the outer zones once held rows of smaller shrines, whose foundations now dominate the field more than their reconstructed forms, hinting at the original density of the complex and reinforcing the sense that Prambanan functioned not as an isolated sanctuary, but as the ceremonial heart of a larger urban and ritual landscape. Inscriptions from the period suggest that its construction coincided with the rise of the Sanjaya dynasty, whose rulers appear to have invested heavily in monumental architecture as a means of asserting legitimacy, yet the site itself avoids overt political messaging, offering no carved portraits of kings or explicit records of conquest, instead expressing authority through alignment, scale, and adherence to cosmic principles. The choice of andesite stone, quarried from nearby volcanic sources, speaks to both practicality and permanence, while the precision of masonry, dry-laid blocks fitted so closely that mortar was unnecessary, reflects a high degree of planning and skilled labour coordinated over years, if not decades. Prambanan's setting, however, is inseparable from the geological forces that both enabled and threatened it, as Java's active tectonic environment has subjected the complex to repeated earthquakes, likely contributing to its early abandonment sometime in the 10th century, when political power shifted eastward and maintenance ceased, allowing vegetation and seismic damage to erode the carefully calibrated forms. Unlike cities that fade through gradual depopulation, Prambanan appears to have been left behind relatively abruptly, its towers partially collapsed, yet not repurposed extensively, preserving a snapshot of ambition interrupted rather than transformed. For centuries, the temples stood in ruin, their stones scattered and overgrown, remembered in local tradition yet detached from their original ritual function, until colonial-era surveys and later Indonesian restoration efforts reassembled portions of the complex through painstaking anastylosis, using original stones wherever possible while acknowledging that much of the site's former density cannot be fully recovered. Walking through Prambanan today, the reconstructed central shrines stand in deliberate contrast to the surrounding field of foundations, a visual reminder of both endurance and loss, as the eye moves repeatedly between what remains vertical and what lies flattened, reinforcing the idea that the site's meaning emerges as much from absence as from presence. Sound travels differently here, carried by open courtyards and interrupted by stone mass, while light traces sharp edges and deep shadows along the reliefs, reactivating narrative sequences that were never meant to be static images but part of a lived processional experience. Despite extensive scholarship, key questions remain unresolved, particularly regarding the precise rituals performed, the scale of the supporting population, and the relationship between Prambanan and nearby Buddhist complexes such as Borobudur, whose proximity suggests not simple opposition, but a more nuanced coexistence of religious systems within a shared cultural framework. Environmental studies, art historical analysis, and epigraphic evidence together outline a society capable of sustaining monumental construction while remaining sensitive to cyclical forces, agricultural seasons, volcanic activity, political realignment that could rapidly reshape priorities. As a result, Prambanan resists being read as a terminal achievement or a fallen capital, instead appearing as a concentrated moment of expression within a longer continuum of Javanese sacred architecture. Standing beneath the towering silhouette of the Shiva temple as evening light softens its sharp geometry, one senses that the complex was never intended to overpower its visitors, but to orient them, to guide attention upward and inward while maintaining harmony with the surrounding plain. And it is this balance between ambition and restraint, narrative clarity and historical silence, that allows Prambanan to remain accessible today, not merely as a collection of ruins to be observed, but as a structured landscape that can still be walked through, measured and contemplated, offering a vision of order that endures even as its original certainties remain quietly out of reach. Persepolis, at the foot of the Kue Rahmat, where the Zagros Mountains soften into the plains of southern Iran, the stone terraces of Persepolis rise with a deliberate calm that contrasts sharply with the drama often associated with imperial power, revealing themselves not as the remnants of a conventional city, but as a carefully staged ceremonial landscape whose meaning unfolds through approach, ascent, and measured movement, rather than through density or enclosure. Founded in the late 6th century BCE under Darius I, and expanded by his successors, Persepolis was conceived less as an administrative capital than as a symbolic heart of the Achaemenid Empire, a place where architecture, ritual, and imperial ideology converged to express unity across vast distances. And this intention becomes evident as one ascends the monumental double staircase leading to the terrace, its shallow steps designed not for haste but for processions, allowing delegations to move upward with dignity, their ascent slow enough to reinforce awareness of arrival rather than urgency. At the summit, the Gate of All Nations stands as a threshold rather than a barrier, flanked by colossal stone figures that combine human and animal forms, their presence not aggressive but watchful, marking entry into a space governed by order rather than force. And beyond them, the terrace opens into a sequence of halls and courtyards, arranged with axial clarity, each structure distinct yet coordinated, reinforcing the impression that Persepolis was intended to be read spatially, as a narrative articulated in stone. The Apadana, the largest audience hall, dominates this composition, its forest of columns, once supporting a vast roof beneath which the king would have received representatives from across the empire. And it is along the stairways of this hall that Persepolis speaks most clearly through reliefs carved with extraordinary restraint, depicting processions of tribute bearers from diverse regions, each group distinguished by dress, posture, and offerings, yet rendered with equal scale and composure, avoiding overt hierarchies and violence, and instead emphasizing participation within a shared imperial framework. These reliefs do not narrate battles or conquest, but coordination, an empire imagined as an ordered assembly rather than a battlefield. And as one traces them panel by panel, the repetition becomes meditative, reinforcing the idea that stability arose from continuity and recognition rather than spectacle. Elsewhere on the terrace, the throne hall, treasury, and smaller palaces echo this logic, their proportions calibrated to function and symbolism rather than habitation, as Persepolis lacks the dense residential quarters, markets, and workshops typical of urban centres, suggesting that it was occupied episodically, likely during ceremonial occasions such as Nowruz, when the renewal of the year aligned political authority with cosmic cycles. The materials themselves reinforce this interpretation, as massive blocks of limestone were quarried, transported, and fitted with precision, while cedar beams imported from distant Lebanon once spanned spaces now open to the sky, a logistical achievement that reflects imperial reach without foregrounding it through explicit record. Inscriptions carved discreetly into walls and doorways name kings and invoke divine favour, yet they remain formulaic and sparse, offering little narrative detail, as if the architecture itself was intended to communicate what words need not elaborate. Walking across the terrace today, one becomes aware of how much of Persepolis' power lay in what it omitted, as there are no statues of rulers dominating plazas, no triumphal arches celebrating victory, and no monuments commemorating specific events. Only a consistent emphasis on balance, symmetry, and repetition, qualities that suggest an empire confident enough to present itself as stable rather than embattled. This restraint complicates the site's later history, particularly its association with destruction, for Persepolis was famously damaged by fire in 330 BCE during Alexander's campaign, an event often framed as deliberate retribution or symbolic conquest. Yet archaeological evidence suggests a more nuanced reality, as some areas burned intensely while others were spared, and administrative archives preserved in clay tablets survived precisely because they were baked by the fire, indicating that the destruction, while dramatic, did not erase the site's material record so much as alter its trajectory. After this episode, Persepolis was not rebuilt, and its terrace gradually fell silent, its stones scavenged selectively, but its core left largely intact, perhaps due to its ceremonial nature, which rendered it less adaptable for reuse, allowing it to persist as a monumental memory rather than a living centre. Environmental exposure softened carvings and toppled columns over centuries, yet the clarity of the plan remains legible, inviting movement that mirrors ancient pathways, encouraging visitors to experience Persepolis not as a ruin frozen in catastrophe, but as a framework whose purpose was always episodic, its emptiness part of its original design rather than solely the result of abandonment. Modern excavation has revealed details of construction techniques, labour organisation, and administrative reach through thousands of tablets inscribed in multiple languages, confirming the empire's diversity while underscoring the site's role as a unifying stage rather than a governing hub. Even so, questions persist about how those who built Persepolis experienced it, how often its spaces were filled, and how ritual and authority intersected in moments now archaeologically indistinct, reminding observers that the site communicates primarily through form rather than narrative. As light moves across the terrace and shadows lengthen between standing columns, the scale shifts subtly, the absence of roofs and crowds heightening awareness of proportion and alignment, and it becomes clear that Persepolis was designed to endure perception rather than occupation, to be walked through slowly, absorbed visually, and remembered as an image of order. This quality allows it to remain accessible today without resolving its ambiguities, offering a vision of empire that prioritized cohesion over domination, symbolism over spectacle, and continuity over declaration. And in doing so, Persepolis stands not as a riddle demanding solution, but as a composed statement whose meaning persists precisely because it resists reduction, remaining a place that can still be walked through while continuing to hold its intentions just beyond the reach of final explanation. Sigiriya Rock Fortress. Rising abruptly from the central plains of Sri Lanka, where forest and cultivated land spread outward in muted continuity, Sigiriya Rock Fortress interrupts the landscape with a vertical certainty that feels geological before it feels human. A massive column of hardened magma whose sheer faces catch light differently as the day progresses. And yet, the experience of approaching Sigiriya on foot reveals that its meaning does not reside solely in height, but in the deliberate sequence of spaces that guide movement from the surrounding water gardens to the summit. A progression that transforms the rock from natural formation into structured place through measured design rather than overwhelming force. The lower gardens, laid out with axial symmetry, channels and reservoirs, introduce an unexpected order at ground level, where water flows through underground conduits and stone-lined pools that still respond to seasonal rains, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering adapted to monsoon cycles. And as one walks these paths, the rock remains partially obscured, appearing and disappearing between trees and embankments, its full scale withheld until closer proximity compels upward attention. Historical sources suggest that Sigiriya was transformed into a royal citadel during the late 5th century CE under King Kashyapa, whose decision to establish his capital atop the rock has often been framed as defensive or symbolic. Yet the material evidence complicates any singular explanation, as the site combines elements of fortress, palace, monastery and landscape garden without resolving neatly into any one category. Ascending through the terraced slopes, the rock's surface reveals traces of human intervention etched directly into stone, including stairways, retaining walls, and platforms that adapt to natural contours rather than impose uniform geometry, suggesting a design philosophy attentive to existing form rather than intent on erasure. Midway up the ascent, the mirror wall emerges as a polished masonry surface that once reflected the frescoes above, its surface later inscribed over centuries with poems and observations left by visitors between the 7th and 13th centuries, transforming the wall into an unintended archive of literacy, aesthetic response, and continuity long after Sigiriya's political role had faded. And these inscriptions, composed in early Sinhala, speak quietly of admiration rather than authority, indicating that the site's power endured culturally even as its original function shifted. Above this corridor, sheltered within a shallow depression in the rock face, the frescoes appear unexpectedly, their painted figures rendered with fluid lines and restrained palettes, depicting women whose identities remain uncertain, often interpreted as celestial beings or courtly figures, yet lacking definitive attributes that would anchor them to a specific narrative, and their survival, fragmentary yet vivid, underscores the selective preservation that defines Sigiriya as a whole, where exposure, intention and chance converge unevenly across surfaces. The ascent continues through the Lion Gate, once marked by a massive sculpted lion whose brick body has vanished, leaving only monumental paws flanking the stairway, an image that operates symbolically without explanatory text, framing passage rather than enforcing it, and reinforcing the sense that Sigiriya communicated through visual threshold rather than inscription. The summit itself defies expectations of density, opening into a flattened plateau where foundations, cisterns and cut pools indicate a complex of structures now largely absent, arranged to capture breezes, manage water, and maintain visual command over the surrounding landscape, suggesting that habitation here prioritized orientation and ritualized movement as much as defense. From this height, the plains extend outward in all directions, dissolving boundaries between cultivated land and forest, reinforcing the impression that Sigiriya's elevated position served not merely to repel approach, but to situate authority within a panoramic field that made the ruler visible to the land as much as the land visible to the ruler. Despite its dramatic setting, the occupation of Sigiriya as a royal centre was brief, and following Kashyapa's death, the site appears to have been largely abandoned as a capital, later repurposed by Buddhist monks who adapted caves and terraces for monastic use, a transition that left minimal architectural disruption, suggesting continuity of reverence rather than rupture. Archaeological evidence offers little indication of violent destruction or prolonged siege, reinforcing the interpretation that Sigiriya's transformation unfolded through political realignment rather than collapse, allowing the rock to recede into a quieter role without erasing its built interventions. Environmental exposure has since shaped the site's present condition, as wind, rain, and biological growth continue to soften edges and dissolve surfaces, even as the core features remain legible enough to reconstruct intent through movement rather than text. Modern conservation has stabilized pathways and frescoes, yet the experience of climbing Sigiriya remains physically demanding, reinforcing the original emphasis on bodily engagement, where ascent itself becomes part of understanding, compressing space, time, and effort into a single trajectory. Standing on the summit, the absence of towering ruins amplifies the surrounding silence, redirecting attention from architecture to alignment, from structure to setting, and it becomes clear that Sigiriya's enduring presence lies not in monumental accumulation but in orchestration, the careful calibration of water, stone, elevation, and visibility. As one descends, retracing the same routes carved into the rock centuries ago, the fortress reveals itself less as a puzzle awaiting solution than as a composed environment whose meanings were distributed across levels rather than concentrated at the top. And it is this diffusion between garden and summit, inscription and silence, nature and intervention, that allows Sigiriya to remain accessible today. A place that can still be walked through in full, yet continues to withhold definitive conclusions, offering instead a sustained encounter with balance, ambition, and impermanence held in deliberate tension. Borobudur. Emerging gradually from the green lowlands of central Java, where volcanic ridges form a distant ring and mist gathers in the early hours above rice fields and rivers, Borobudur reveals itself less as a building than as a landscape shaped into stone, a terraced rise whose symmetry only becomes apparent through movement, as the eye follows horizontal lines that step upward with disciplined restraint rather than dramatic ascent. And walking toward it, the monument resists immediate comprehension, appearing at first as a broad, grounded mass rather than a towering structure, its scale revealed not through height but through accumulation, repetition, and the slow disclosure of detail. Constructed in the 8th and 9th centuries during the Sailendra dynasty, Borobudur was conceived as a three-dimensional mandala, a cosmological diagram translated into architecture. Yet its presence on the ground remains resolutely physical, rooted in volcanic stone quarried locally and assembled without mortar. Each block locked into place with precision that speaks to careful planning and sustained labour rather than improvisation. The monument's form guides the visitor along a prescribed path, beginning at the base and spiralling upward through a series of galleries, each level marked by relief panels carved in astonishing quantity and consistency, depicting scenes from Buddhist teachings, moral tales, and aspects of daily life rendered with quiet attentiveness to gesture and environment. And as one walks these corridors, the repetition becomes meditative, the act of movement inseparable from observation, reinforcing the idea that Borobudur was intended to be experienced bodily rather than viewed from a single vantage point. The lower terraces, once partially concealed by an encasement added shortly after construction, introduce themes of desire, consequence, and attachment, their imagery dense and didactic, while higher levels gradually shift toward greater abstraction, with fewer narrative scenes and increasing emphasis on symbolic form, a progression that mirrors Buddhist conceptions of the path toward enlightenment, without relying on inscriptional explanation. Above the square galleries, the monument opens into circular terraces populated by perforated stupas, each housing a seated Buddha figure, their repetition creating a rhythmic visual field that dissolves individuality into pattern, while the central stupa rises unadorned, empty of statue, emphasizing absence rather than representation as a culminating statement. The surrounding landscape, plays an essential role in this experience, as Borobudur was deliberately aligned with nearby volcanoes and sacred sites, embedding it within a broader ritual geography that linked natural forces with spiritual aspiration. And the monument's elevated position would have made it visible across the plain, serving as both focal point and orienting presence, without enclosing a population or functioning as an urban centre. Unlike many monumental sites, Borobudur lacks evidence of long-term habitation, markets, or administrative buildings, suggesting that it functioned primarily as a pilgrimage destination rather than a residential hub, a place visited periodically rather than occupied continuously, which may help explain its eventual abandonment when political power shifted and patronage declined. Environmental factors contributed quietly to this retreat, as volcanic eruptions, seismic activity, and the encroachment of jungle vegetation gradually obscured the monument, allowing it to recede from visibility without being dismantled or violently destroyed, preserved instead by burial and neglect. Local memory retained knowledge of the site in fragmentary form, but it was not until the 19th century that Borobudur was systematically cleared and studied, revealing the extent of its reliefs and architectural logic, and subsequent restoration efforts sought to stabilize its form while respecting its original materials, a balance that mirrors the monument's own emphasis on order maintained through repetition. Despite extensive research, questions remain regarding the precise rituals performed here, the scale and organization of pilgrimages, and the relationship between Borobudur and nearby Buddhist and Hindu complexes, including Prambanan, whose proximity suggests a cultural landscape characterized by coexistence and shared patronage rather than strict division. Inscriptions from the period offer limited guidance, leaving scholars to infer meaning primarily through spatial sequence, iconography, and comparison with textual traditions, a method that yields coherence without closure. Walking Borobudur today, the physical act of ascent enforces a slow pace, encouraging attention to texture, rhythm, and alignment, while the absence of enclosed interiors keeps the surrounding world present at every level, sky and land, visible through balustrades and openings, reinforcing the idea that enlightenment here was not imagined as escape from the world, but as reorientation within it. The monument's endurance depends not on monumental verticality but on structural clarity, its interlocking stones distributing weight evenly across terraces, a design that has allowed it to withstand centuries of environmental stress while remaining legible in form. As clouds drift across the plain and shadows move over reliefs carved more than a millennium ago, Borobudur resists interpretation as either a lost city or a static shrine, instead presenting itself as a process set in stone, one that continues to unfold through each step taken along its paths. And when the summit is finally reached, the view outward dissolves the monument's boundaries, returning attention to the wider landscape from which it rises, completing a circuit that is experiential rather than explanatory, and leaving behind not a sense of mystery unresolved through speculation, but a quieter recognition that Borobudur's meaning was never meant to be fully stated, only enacted, a place that can still be walked through today and understood through movement, while retaining a reserve that no single visit or interpretation can exhaust. Great Zimbabwe, set within the rolling granite uplands of southeastern Africa, where kopjes rise gently from savanna grassland and seasonal rains move predictably across the plateau. Great Zimbabwe unfolds not as a single monument, but as a dispersed architectural landscape whose coherence only becomes apparent through sustained movement, as one passes between stone walls that curve rather than dominate, enclosing space without sealing it, guiding rather than confining. And it is this quiet control of form that defines the site from the outset, resisting spectacle while asserting permanence through scale and repetition. Constructed primarily between the 11th and 15th centuries, Great Zimbabwe served as the political and economic centre of a powerful Shona-speaking society whose influence extended across much of southern Africa. Yet its builders relied on no mortar, no inscriptions, and no overt displays of conquest, instead shaping millions of granite blocks into walls that rise in places over 10 metres high, their courses subtly angled and carefully balanced, revealing an empirical understanding of weight, friction, and stability, refined through generations of experimentation. The hill complex, perched atop a granite outcrop, forms the oldest and most elevated portion of the site, its passages winding between natural boulders and dry stone walls in ways that blur the boundary between architecture and geology, suggesting that authority here was associated with elevation, enclosure, and controlled access, rather than separation from the landscape. And as one climbs these narrow routes, the space compresses and expands unpredictably, reinforcing an experiential hierarchy rather than a purely visual one. Below, the great enclosure dominates the valley floor, its massive elliptical wall enclosing a large interior space whose precise function remains debated, as the enclosure contains no obvious domestic structures commensurate with its scale, instead presenting a monumental boundary that appears to have been as significant as whatever activities occurred within it. An impression reinforced by the presence of the enigmatic conical tower, a solid stone structure without interior chambers, often interpreted as a symbol of abundance, authority, or continuity, though its meaning resists definitive classification. Surrounding these monumental cores lie extensive valley ruins, composed of smaller enclosures and living areas, indicating that Great Zimbabwe was not a ceremonial shell, but a densely inhabited centre where elites and commoners occupied distinct yet interconnected zones, their spatial relationships reflecting social organisation expressed through proximity, visibility, and access rather than explicit markers of rank. Artifacts recovered from these areas, including locally produced ceramics, iron tools, and spindle whorls, anchor daily life within the site, while imported materials such as glass beads, Chinese porcelain, and Persian ceramics testify to Great Zimbabwe's integration into long-distance trade networks linking the interior of Africa to the Swahili coast and beyond. An economic reach that complicates older narratives which once denied indigenous authorship of the site. These external connections appear to have been managed without transforming Great Zimbabwe into a mercantile port or cosmopolitan hub, as the architecture remains distinctly local in technique and form, emphasizing continuity with regional building traditions even as wealth flowed inward, suggesting a society confident enough to absorb influence without architectural imitation. Environmental context further clarifies this balance, as the surrounding plateau supported cattle herding, agriculture, and access to gold-bearing regions, allowing surplus accumulation that underwrote both trade and monumental construction. Yet the site's location also imposed constraints, particularly on water availability, reinforcing the importance of seasonal cycles and landscape knowledge in sustaining urban life without centralized hydraulic infrastructure. Walking through the ruins today, the absence of decoration becomes increasingly noticeable, as the walls are largely unadorned, save for occasional chevron patterns or courses of darker stone, subtle embellishments that draw attention to craftsmanship rather than narrative. And this restraint aligns with a broader pattern in which meaning was communicated through form, placement, and repetition instead of explicit imagery. Despite the site's scale, there is little evidence of defensive architecture in the conventional sense, as walls curve gracefully and lack battlements or arrow slits, suggesting that their primary function was symbolic and organizational rather than military, reinforcing the interpretation of Great Zimbabwe as a centre of authority, maintained through social cohesion and ritual legitimacy rather than constant conflict. By the 15th century, however, the site was gradually abandoned, its population dispersing to other centres in the region, a process likely driven by a combination of environmental stress, resource depletion, and shifting trade routes that reduce the advantages of maintaining such a large aggregation in one place. Yet, the archaeological record offers no indication of sudden collapse or destruction, instead pointing toward an orderly withdrawal that preserved the walls largely intact. Oral traditions, preserved among descendant communities, frame Great Zimbabwe not as a fallen city but as an ancestral place, whose significance persists beyond physical occupation, a perspective that aligns with the site's material continuity, as its walls endured long after roofs decayed and organic materials returned to the soil. Colonial-era interpretations once attributed the ruins to distant civilizations, an error rooted not in evidence but in assumption, later corrected through systematic excavation and contextual analysis that firmly established Great Zimbabwe as the product of local ingenuity, restoring the site to its rightful historical framework without diminishing its complexity. Modern conservation efforts now balance accessibility with preservation, allowing visitors to walk the same passages shaped centuries ago while acknowledging the vulnerability of dry stone construction to erosion and human impact. As light shifts across the granite blocks and shadows trace the curves of walls whose builders left no written explanation, the experience of Great Zimbabwe becomes one of measured ambiguity, where function can be inferred but not fully named, authority felt but not proclaimed. The site does not present itself as a riddle demanding solution, nor as a monument frozen in triumph, but as a spatial argument made in stone, one that once organized power, economy, and belief through presence rather than declaration. And it is this quality that allows Great Zimbabwe to remain compelling today, a place that can still be walked through in full, its paths open and its walls standing, yet whose deepest meanings remain embedded in form and memory rather than text, inviting attention without insisting on conclusion, and leaving behind an impression not of mystery unresolved, but of intention sustained across centuries, quiet, durable, and deliberately incomplete.